Thanks very much for that speech, and thanks so much for engaging with us on the process. It's been a really positive process of engagement on the white paper, and I think this is the first time for 20 years the government has actually approached the housing issue not simply by saying we need to weaken planning to get housing built, but actually looked to see who is going to build the houses in the first place. It's also the first time for quite a few years when the government hasn't simply picked up some clever but not quite clever enough ideas from Policy Exchange or one of the other anti-planning think tanks and recycled them. So it's been a really positive engagement. I could just say I agree and sit down, but I'm not paid to do that. So I'm going to raise three points of concern, two of which you've mentioned yourself. One is on housing targets. We look forward to the consultation on getting an agreed methodology for calculating objectively assessed need. What I hear all the time from CPRE branches across the country is a sense that housing targets are undeliverable based on a kind of voodoo science, and the impact they have is that because the house builders won't build enough, then more greenfield sites get released, or the local authority finds it hasn't got a plan, and you get developers cherry-picking greenfield sites, you get land speculators like Gladman gaming the system, and you end up with kind of huge distrust in the planning process, and therefore organisations, groups like CPRE, sort of getting down in the trenches fighting. So I hope that we come up with a method of calculating housing targets that has credibility, but also where the housing target, where every effort is being made to meet the housing target. If it's not working, the solution isn't simply to release more greenfield land. And I don't think that's your intention, but that's something we'll certainly be looking at. Secondly, you mentioned the point about need and demand. There's no problem at all. We'd have no problem with a local authority having aspirations to meet housing demand. I mean, people, as we get richer, people want nicer houses to live in. A local authority might want to go for growth. There's no problem at all in that. But there are some local authorities that are actually meeting that kind of demand, but aren't meeting need. And if you want a CPRE group to sacrifice bits of the countryside or be open about a Greenbelt review, they're not going to be open to give people bigger homes or second homes or third homes or homes for investment. There's a real distinction, I think, between meeting need and meeting demand. And I was encouraged by your comments on that. The third point, I guess, is about strategic planning. And we have emphasised again and again that if you want to have a constructive conversation on housing with groups like CPRE, there has got to be consent for new developments to as great an extent as possible. A sense they come with infrastructure, well designed, good affordability, decent engagement, using brownfield first, and so on. So absolutely, localism is great for engaging with local communities and getting consent for new development. But at some point, I think there does need to be more of a planned approach to meeting development pressures, particularly in London and the South East, and indeed evening out growth across the country. And simply delegating some of those really difficult decisions to 300-odd local authorities ends up with quite a confused politics. I think people expect the government to have a real vision for where growth should go, and particularly how much is going in the South East. Are we simply trying to build houses in the places people want to live, to quote the Secretary of State, or are we going to try to make other places people want to live by evening out growth across the country? And that's something I think we'll be working on in the coming years. The last thing I just say is, as most people know, I'm moving on from CPRE, so I'm delighted to accept the challenge that you set out. But actually, I think the board and the branches also do accept that challenge, that there is a real willingness to talk not only in the abstract about the need to accept new housing, but actually to do it in reality and to say these are the sites where the housing should go. We might not like it, we would prefer not to build on that greenfield site, but we recognise the need, and if it's done well and the engagement is done well and the houses are of good design and places people want to live, and which in some cases can make the area more beautiful and more attractive, then CPRE is, I believe, up for that conversation. The basis of it, of course, is having faith in the planning system in the first place, and I think the white paper goes a long way to helping us have that assurance. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, huge thanks for the invite to be here. And I can't resist a platform sat next to the Minister without doing a little sales pitch for why planning is so important to this country. Planning has been really good for Britain. Now, we're often the butt of jokes. We get blamed for everything from recessions to no car parking spaces. And as one of my colleagues always says, we're about as popular as going for dental surgery. But planning has been hugely important to our nation. We have a lot to thank the planning pioneers for because they have really shaped the country as it is today. Since the end of the 19th century, planning has made a massive contribution to improving the quality of life for ordinary people. Planning has delivered decent housing for millions of people right across this country, and thanks to campaigns with organisations like CPRE and the Town and Country Planning Association, we have protected some of our most valuable landscapes from urban sprawl and piecemeal development that characterises so much of the States and of Europe. Planning has also helped us deliver mixed communities, and that is something that's really important to keep hold of, that actually we've got to meet the needs of everybody in society. But in saying all of that, I have to point out that planning in England at the moment is in a pretty tough place. Our local authorities are struggling with resources, they feel pretty demoralised, and deregulation creates some challenges for them. And so the Housing White Paper is a really important moment for starting a new conversation about the kind of country we want to live in and the role of planning in helping us achieve that. Now, there's loads in the white paper I could talk about. And I thought like Shaun, would pick 3 things, but I'm going to do 3 things that we're really pleased about and 3 things where we really want to keep the conversation going. So, firstly, is that point about an honest conversation. This paper is the first step in reframing the debate about how we solve the housing crisis. And it acknowledges that this is a really complex problem and it needs a range of solutions, and that's hugely important. It's time we moved on from the polarised debate where we have housing and the economy on one hand and the environment on the other. They're 2 sides of the same coin. And in recasting that debate, let's put people at the heart of this. Who are we doing this all for? It's for society. It's for people, and people must come first. Who are the homes for? Who are the communities for? So it's a consultation. Isn't that great? It's not straight into legislation. It's actually a document where we can all look at the detail of it and come up with constructive solutions. And there's a consultation in particular around the National Planning Policy Framework. So that's my first point. Secondly, I think it's hugely welcome that we have a measured and pragmatic approach to the housing mix. So we have different types of tenure and different types of delivery, and a recognition that we have to have resources and planning to deliver that. And thirdly, for the TCPA, it marks a really significant moment in our history. 110 years on from the first garden city being started, 70 years on from the first new town being designated, the government has committed to legislate to enable the creation of locally accountable new town development corporations, enabling local areas to use them as a delivery vehicle if they wish to. Now, I had to read that bit out because that's the precise wording. Government's not imposing this, it's a tool in the box if local authorities want to use it. It might seem unusual to fly the flag for new towns at a CPRE lecture, but actually CPRE historically supported new towns as a way of protecting the countryside. That post-war settlement that you were talking about was so important. It was new towns and Greenbelt hand in hand. And so that pledge marks a really important step forward. In terms of my 3 things very briefly where we'd like to keep the conversation going, firstly is on standards. So there's great content in the white paper on design, and we heard about community-led design from the Minister. That is hugely important. I think we have to also look at some pretty dreadful houses that have been built lately. Lots of stories in the press about people living in poor quality new build. We've got to reconcile these 2 things, and we need to work to ensure that the standards that come forward make sure our housing quality is better, not worse. Secondly, absolutely have to support local authority innovation. Again, we heard from the Minister about councils have a crucial role to play as part of the housing mix. Again, there's some detail in there about whether the policy is going to enable innovation, and we don't want to risk shutting it off before it's really got underway. So lots there to play for, but to keep the conversation going. And then thirdly, we're not quite sure yet, but does the white paper mean that actually some pretty radical changes to planning? Is there a possibility that local authorities would no longer have a requirement to do a local plan, but you'd have a strategic and a neighbourhood tier in some places? And if that is the case, great that the door is open on innovation in plan making, but let's make sure we get the place-making bit right and we know where that firmly lands so people get the quality they expect. Very quickly, just to end, is to say we've had a call for action here, both from Shaun and from the Minister, to get involved. And it's absolutely clear that this government is committed to getting the homes built, and we should support that, and we do support that. But if we think some of the policies might not deliver the right quality of houses in the right places, now is the time to get involved in the conversation. Let's work together to come up with constructive solutions and work with government. And that's a challenge for all of us, not just conservation and countryside groups like CPRE, but politicians, business leaders, academics, environmentalists, planners, architects, community groups, everybody interested in seeing quality places delivered. We need to have the determination to leave future generations with a legacy of beauty and durability that meets the challenges of the 21st century. We have a government that's willing to do this task, so let's get involved. Thanks.
The focus of the white paper, I think, is extremely welcome. Most specifically, as the Minister said, the simple but actually very powerful recognition that we have to shift from a demand-stimulating policy towards the housing crisis towards one of ensuring more supply. It sounds like a very kind of banal thing to say, but actually I want to pay tribute to the kind of political courage that takes, because it really is a massive reversal of where we were only a year ago, when people like ourselves spent a lot of time battling some frankly unhelpful measures in the Housing and Planning Act 2016, and it's really encouraging to see the new government recognising that actually the solutions here are about supply. They're not about just stoking ever more financialised demand for the existing crop of houses. So very much welcome that. Secondly, that does mean that we have to do all the kind of technical voodoo science of assessing need correctly. I don't claim to have the answer to those problems, but I would just like to make one plea to the Minister, but also to everyone in CPRE branches, that need has to take proper account of the people that shelter represents, who do not appear in CPRE meetings. They do not appear in most local assessments because they are homeless, because they are sofa surfing, because they are either highly mobile, and they are simply not captured in most systems for assessing the demographics of a particular area. We have to take account of that need at a national level as well as a hyperlocal one. Otherwise, we will be simply designing a housing system that suits the interests of those who are well housed and comfortable, instead, and denies opportunities for a decent home to those who are currently homeless. So please, when inevitably there will be difficult conversations about assessing need in local areas, but please bear in mind the needs of those who don't have a home. But finally, what I really welcome in the white paper is the recognition that there are other problems in housing that are not just to do with assessing needs or the planning system. The Minister referenced already things like the problem of planning permissions not being built out, the need for greater diversity. All of these are entirely true. And while there is no silver bullet to these problems, they do all have one central feature. They're all about the land market. And the elements of the white paper that I welcome the most are those that focus on actually addressing some of the problems in our land market. The creation of new development corporations at a local level, the ability to compulsory purchase sites that are stalled, the really welcome measures on increasing transparency, so that maybe for the first time we can actually begin to understand who owns and, more importantly, controls land in our housing system. Without that information, we really cannot have that sensible conversation. So I really welcome some of those measures too. Finally, I'll just say that I think that if we can hold our nerve and follow through on some of these measures, which will be challenging and will meet with opposition, I think we have a real opportunity here to spearhead a new consensus in house building. I think there is a huge amount of enthusiasm for high quality development that delivers the affordable homes people need, that provide the infrastructure that's in keeping with the local area, that's in the right places. And we really can do that as long as we intervene in the land market sufficiently to capture the value that is there in development and channel that into the things that people need. That means affordable housing, infrastructure, and high-quality development. It's perfectly possible. We used to lead the world in this country. We've just lost the art in the last 40 years. But now's the time to remember our civic traditions of house building and create a kind of new positive consensus for development in the right places.